beneath the current-day capital of Mexico, lie the ruins of the ancient Aztec metropolis known as Tenochtitlan.
The Teotihuacan is actually many, many thousands of years older than what archaeologists say.
Under Mexico City, there's a drowned empire. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés crossed the causeways and saw Tenochtitlan rising from the middle of a vast lake,
Hernán Cortés is remembered for conquering the Aztec Empire and also for being the first governor of New Spain.
he wasn't looking at a tribe of wanderers. He was staring at a superpower, a city of 250,000 people, gridded canals, floating farms, towering pyramids, markets larger than anything in Spain. And yet, just 2 centuries earlier, the people who built it were outcasts, migrants handed a swamp no one else wanted. The answer isn't just buried in stone. It's encoded in blood, in ancient DNA that is rewriting the origin story of power in the Americas. The first blood. To understand where the Aztecs came from, you have to go back, way back. Not centuries, millennia.
The year was 1300. The Aztecs, originally a nomadic people who called themselves the Mexica,
But because the genetic story of Mesoamerica doesn't begin with the Mexica, or the Toltecs, or even the Olmec, it begins with ice, and a walk that nobody planned to take. Roughly 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, sea levels dropped over 400 feet. That drop exposed a massive stretch of land between Siberia and Alaska, a region scientists call Beringia. And it wasn't some narrow, frozen bridge like you see in the textbook illustrations. It was a landmass the size of Texas, tundra, grassland, cold but livable, and for generations, small bands of hunter-gatherers survived there.
13,000 years ago, before the rise of civilization, people around the world lived as hunter-gatherers in small groups.
Genetically isolated from both Asia and the Americas. They weren't on a mission. They weren't migrating. They were stuck, trapped between 2 continental ice sheets, living on megafauna and stubbornness, with nowhere to go. Then, at around 16,000 years ago, the ice began to crack. A coastal corridor opened along the Pacific shoreline, and those people, maybe a few thousand total, some geneticists estimate as few as a couple hundred breeding individuals, began to move south. Fast. Stunningly fast. In 2008, a team of researchers analyzed DNA from a child's skeleton found at the Anzac burial site in Montana, dated to roughly 12,600 years ago. That child, known as Anzac 1, carried genetic markers linking it directly to both ancient Beringians.
The skull of a young child. In the years since, archaeologists concluded that the skull was about 12,700 years old, the oldest known burial in North America,
and to modern indigenous populations from Central and South America. One child, buried in Montana, genetically connected to people who would eventually build pyramids in the jungles of Guatemala. The thread is that long, and that unbroken. Within just 2,000 to 3,000 years, our descendants of that founding population had reached the southern tip of Chile. We know this because of Monte Verde, an archaeological site near Puerto Montt that shattered the old Clovis first model of American settlement. Human tools, shelters, and food remains at Monte Verde date to at least 14,500 years ago, proving people were already deep in South America while ice still covered half of North America.
The Bagley Ice Field. It's the largest non-polar ice field in North America.
It remains one of the most rapid large-scale human dispersals in recorded prehistory. And here's the staggering part. Every single indigenous person in the Americas today, from the Inuit of northern Canada to the Mapuche of Chile, from the Navajo to the Yanomami, traces their ancestry back to that original founding population. But here's where genetics gets interesting. That founding group was small, extremely small, and the genetic bottleneck was severe, meaning the starting diversity was narrow. So as populations spread and settled across wildly different environments, deserts, jungles, mountain plateaus, tropical coastlines, they began to diverge. Not just culturally, genetically. Natural selection went to work. In the highlands of central Mexico, sitting at over 7,000 feet of elevation, populations developed adaptations to thinner oxygen. A 2014 study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology identified specific gene variants in highland Mesoamerican populations associated with altitude tolerance, variants not found in coastal or lowland groups. Populations adapted to different diets, too. The domestication of maize, which began around 9,000 years ago in the Balsas River Valley of southwestern Mexico, triggered genetic shifts related to starch metabolism and nutrient absorption. People weren't just farming a new crop. Their bodies were changing to process it. And by the time we reached the age of the great Mesoamerican civilizations, the Olmec carving colossal stone heads along the Gulf Coast around 1500 BCE, the Maya constructing astronomical observatories by 600 BCE, the mysterious builders of Teotihuacan raising the Pyramid of the Sun around 100 CE.
At the site of the main temple of Teotihuacan, called the Pyramid of the Sun, which sits just north of the Valley of Mexico.
In a city that would swell to 125,000 people, you're looking at populations that had been genetically diverging for over 10,000 years. They shared deep ancestry, yes. They were all children of Beringia. But they were not the same people, not anymore. Their genomes tell us that. And this matters enormously, because when the Mexica finally enter the picture around the 13th century, they don't walk into an empty valley. They walk into a genetic landscape that is already layered, ancient, and staggeringly complex. Where exactly did the Mexica fit into that landscape, and what made them so different from everyone already there? The wanderers. According to their own mythology, the Mexica came from a place called Aztlan.
The Aztec origin story.
When it comes to the origins of the Aztecs, they claim to have originated from some mythical land called Aztlan.
A semi-mythical homeland somewhere to the north, an island in the middle of a lake, surrounded by herons and white willows. The word Aztec itself comes from Aztlan. Their origin story, recorded in documents like the Codex Boturini, a pre-Columbian accordion-folded manuscript that somehow survived the Spanish conquest, depicts the Mexica leaving Aztlan around 1116 CE, guided by their patron god Huitzilopochtli, who spoke to them through the beak of a bird. And he told them to walk south, to keep walking until they found an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. That image, by the way, still sits at the center of the Mexican flag today. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Aztlan was a real place or a founding myth, a sacred story, a young empire told about itself to justify its destiny. Historians have proposed locations everywhere from Nayarit on Mexico's Pacific coast to the marshlands of Lake Chapala in Jalisco, even as far north as the American Southwest. Nobody has found it. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Aztlan was never a pin on a map. Maybe it was a memory of movement itself. But genetics doesn't deal in myth. It deals in markers, haplogroups, allele frequencies, single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny, trackable mutations in DNA that act like molecular breadcrumbs across thousands of years. And over the past decade, a growing body of genomic research has started to sketch a picture of who the Mexica actually were before they arrived in central Mexico. The picture is fascinating, and it largely confirms the direction of the myth, if not its details. Here's what we know. The Mexica spoke Nahuatl, a language belonging to the Uto-Aztecan family.
Nahuatl is a language belonging to the Uto-Aztecan family, primarily spoken in Mexico.
That family is enormous. It stretches from the Shoshone and Comanche of the Great Basin and Plains, through the Hopi of Arizona, down through the Yaqui and Tarahumara of northwestern Mexico, and into the Nahuatl-speaking heartland of central Mexico. In 2012, linguist Jane Hill at the University of Arizona proposed that the Uto-Aztecan homeland was likely in the region of what is now southern Arizona or northern Sonora, with southward migrations beginning as early as 3000 BCE. That's a 5,000-year drift, generation by generation, from arid scrubland into the volcanic highlands and fertile valleys of Mesoamerica. Genetic evidence now supports this linguistic trail. Studies analyzing ancient DNA from pre-Columbian remains across Mexico have identified shared mitochondrial haplogroups, specifically haplogroups A2 and B2, which are dominant among indigenous populations of western and northern Mexico, in both northern desert communities and later populations in the Valley of Mexico. A landmark 2014 study published in Science, led by researchers at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, mapped the genetic structure of modern Mexican populations and found a clear north-south cline, a gradual genetic gradient consistent with waves of southward migration over millennia. The Mexica weren't an anomaly. They were the tail end of a migration pattern that had been unfolding for thousands of years. So the Aztlan myth? It might not be entirely wrong. Not in its specifics. There was probably no single island paradise, no literal divine bird whispering directions, but the broad strokes, a people from the north walking south over generations, carrying their language and their genes into a new and already populated world, that part holds up. The DNA says so. And when they finally arrived in the Valley of Mexico around the 1240s, they arrived as outsiders. The valley was already a crowded political chessboard, dominated by powerful city-states like Culhuacan, Azcapotzalco, and Texcoco, each with centuries of established lineage, architecture, and trade networks. The Mexica had none of that. They were genetically distinct enough from the settled populations, carrying those northern markers, those desert haplogroups, to be immediately recognizable, different, foreign, and absolutely unwelcome. Every established power in the valley called them Chichimecs.
So the Chichimeca are a group of people from different groups.
A Nahuatl term that roughly translates to dog people or lineage of dogs. It was not a compliment. The Mexica were pushed from settlement to settlement, exploited as mercenaries, forced to fight other people's wars. At one point, they were allowed to settle near Tizapan by the ruler of Culhuacan, who reportedly gave them the worst land available, hoping the rattlesnakes infesting the area would kill them off. Instead, the Mexica ate the snakes. They survived. They always survived. And within 200 years, their descendants would rule everything from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, commanding tribute from over 500 city-states. The genetic record is starting to tell us one crucial reason why they didn't stay separate. They couldn't afford to. The strategic bloodline. This is where the story gets brilliant. Because the Mexica didn't just fight their way to power, they married their way there, and the genetic evidence is starting to confirm what historians have long suspected. The Aztec Empire was, in many ways, built on strategic reproduction. Let's set the scene. When the Mexica founded Tenochtitlan around 1325, and they were politically insignificant.
The Aztecs dominated much of central Mexico from the 14th to the 16th century AD, and Tenochtitlan is considered to be their first official settlement.
They had no royal lineage, no claim to legitimacy, no inherited authority. In the hierarchical world of Mesoamerican politics, lineage was everything. You couldn't just seize power. You needed blood ties to the great civilizations of the past. So the Mexica did something incredibly calculated. They asked the ruler of Culhuacan, a city-state that claimed direct descent from the Toltecs, for one of his daughters. They wanted a royal bride, a woman whose bloodline carried the prestige of Toltec ancestry. And they got one. Her name is not well preserved in the historical record, but the political move is unmistakable. The Mexica were grafting themselves onto the most prestigious lineage in Mesoamerica. This was not a one-time event. Over the next century and a half, the Mexica elite engaged in a systematic program of intermarriage with the noble families of surrounding city-states. Each marriage was a genetic transaction. Each child born of those unions carried in their DNA a claim to multiple political legacies. The Mexico ruling class became a genetic mosaic, part northern migrant, part Toltec descendant, part local Valley of Mexico population. And this wasn't just about politics, it was about biology. Genetic admixture, the mixing of previously separated populations, increases genetic diversity. It can enhance immune response, improve adaptability, introduce new physical and cognitive traits into a population. The Mexica weren't thinking in these terms, obviously, but the effect was real. By absorbing the gene pools of every culture they encountered, the Mexica elite became, as in a very literal sense, the genetic product of all of Mesoamerica. Meanwhile, the empire's expansion through conquest added another layer. As the Aztec military machine rolled over neighboring territories, populations were absorbed. Tribute states sent not just gold and jade and cacao, but people, slaves, servants, sacrificial captives, and, critically, women. The genetic mixing accelerated, and the empire's population became increasingly diverse. Recent genetic studies of remains from the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, the Aztec Empire's sacred center, have confirmed this. The individuals buried and sacrificed there came from all over Mesoamerica. Their DNA shows origins in the Maya lowlands, the Mixtec highlands, the Gulf Coast, the Pacific Coast. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a political capital, it was a genetic crossroads. The invisible plague. Now we arrive at the part of the story everyone thinks they know. The Spanish came. They brought guns, steel, and disease. The Aztec Empire fell. End of story.
The Aztecs then confronted another powerful enemy, smallpox. Brought aboard Spanish ships, the disease decimated the Aztec population, killing the new emperor and thousands of others.
Except it's not the end of the story, not even close, because the genetic dimension of the collapse is far more devastating and far more specific than the popular narrative suggests. Here's what most people don't understand. The diseases that decimated the indigenous population, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, didn't just kill a lot of people. They killed specific people, and the reason comes down to genetics. Remember that founding bottleneck? The one from 16,000 years ago? It had a long shadow. Because the initial colonizing population of the Americas was so small, their immune gene diversity was limited from the start. Specifically, the human leukocyte antigen system, the HLA complex, which is the core of the adaptive immune system, was far less diverse in indigenous American populations than in European or African populations. This wasn't because indigenous peoples had weak immune systems. They didn't. Their immune systems were finely tuned to the pathogens of the Americas, but those pathogens were different. The Americas had fewer domesticated animals, which meant fewer zoonotic diseases, the kind that jump from animals to humans and drive immune evolution. Europe and Asia, with their cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, and rats, were pathogen factories. Their populations had been forged in epidemic after epidemic for thousands of years. Their HLA diversity reflected that brutal history. So when European diseases hit the Americas, and it wasn't just that indigenous people hadn't been exposed before, it was that their immune systems, genetically speaking, had fewer tools to fight back. The HLA variants that might have offered some protection simply didn't exist in the population. The result was catastrophic. Mortality rates of 60, 70, 80, even 90% in some communities within the first century of contact. And here's the gut punch. Recent ancient DNA studies have found evidence of natural selection operating in real time during this period. The survivors, the indigenous people who lived through the epidemics, show a measurable shift in their HLA profiles compared to pre-contact populations. The genomes of survivors carry immune variants that are statistically associated with resistance to the very diseases that killed their relatives. Think about what that means. The epidemic didn't just reduce the population, it genetically filtered it. The indigenous people alive today are, in a real biological sense, the descendants of those whose specific genetic makeup gave them even a slightly better chance of surviving the worst pandemic in human history. That's not just history, that's evolution, happening in front of us, written in living DNA. Blood that survives. There's a common myth, one rooted in colonial propaganda and 5 centuries of repetition, that the Aztec civilization was destroyed, wiped out, that it exists only in museum glass and crumbling ruins. You hear it in the way people talk. The lost civilization, the vanished empire, as if the Mexica simply evaporated when the Spanish flag went up over Tenochtitlan in August 1521. This is wrong, not just inaccurate, dangerously, profoundly wrong, and modern genetics is proving it. Start with language. Today, approximately 1.7 million people in Mexico speak Nahuatl as their first language. That makes it the most widely spoken indigenous language in North America. It's not a relic, it's alive. There are Nahuatl radio stations, Nahuatl rap artists, Nahuatl language Wikipedia pages. Others think the fill was simply convenient debris, whatever was available to do the job. The burial preserved the carvings with remarkable fidelity. Protected from weathering, the animal reliefs retained details that 11,000 years of exposure would have erased completely. At Karahantepe, the rectangular building tells a similar story.
Our new settlement in Karahantepe will be older. That's a pretty big boast.
Those 3.5-meter walls with their preserved plaster coating could not have survived open to the elements. Plaster degrades within decades when exposed to rain and temperature cycles. For it to remain intact across millennia, the structure must have been sealed, protected, entombed while still essentially intact. Someone made a choice to end the building's active use while preserving its physical form. Why would anyone do this? The question has no satisfying answer, only speculation that reveals more about us than about them. Some researchers propose ritual explanations. Perhaps these were sacred spaces with defined lifespans, meant to serve a purpose and then be ceremonially closed when that purpose was fulfilled. Temples decommissioned according to beliefs we cannot reconstruct. Others suggest practical motivations. Maybe environmental changes or population shifts forced communities to relocate, and they buried their monuments to protect them during an absence they expected to be temporary, an absence that became permanent. The most unsettling interpretation sees the burials as evidence of deliberate termination, a society choosing to end a tradition it could no longer sustain. Picture the last generation capable of understanding what these places meant, recognizing that their children or grandchildren would not carry the knowledge forward. Rather than watch the sacred sites fall into misuse or desecration, they chose preservation through concealment. A time capsule buried not for future generations to find, but simply to protect something precious from an uncertain future. There's something almost tender about that possibility, and something deeply sad. People who built monuments meant to last forever, ultimately accepting that forever had an end date. People who understood their own trajectory well enough to know that what they had inherited would not survive them. Did they grieve as they shoveled earth over carved stone faces? Did they perform ceremonies we cannot imagine? Did they believe the burial was temporary, that someday someone would return to uncover what they had hidden? In a strange way, we owe everything we know about these sites to the decision to bury them. Had they been left exposed, time would have won. 11,000 years of freeze and thaw, rain and sun, wind and root growth would have reduced these monuments to unrecognizable rubble. The burial that ended their active life preserved them for discovery. The people who hid these places gave them to us, whether they intended to or not. And now we stand in excavation trenches, carefully removing the fill they so carefully placed, asking questions they cannot answer, and finding meaning they may never have anticipated. History, unseen. Only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated.
It says excavation work at settlements and archaeological site at Karahan Tepe, located in Turkey's.
The broader region likely contains hundreds of similar sites, not yet discovered or investigated. Ground-penetrating radar and survey techniques continue to identify new locations across southeastern Turkey. The 2025 findings came from intensified work at known sites, but the unknown sites vastly outnumber what we've examined. We don't know how many people lived in this region 11,000 years ago. We don't know how they organized themselves politically. We don't know what language they spoke or whether they had writing or proto-writing systems we haven't recognized. We don't know the full extent of their trade networks or how far their cultural influence reached. We don't know what they believed. The temple label for Göbekli Tepe is convenient, but almost certainly oversimplified. Were these gathering places for periodic feasts, ritual centers for regional ceremonies, astronomical observatories, meeting halls for trade and social exchange? The tiered benches at Karahan Tepe suggest audiences watching something, but we don't know what. The carved faces suggest meaning, but we can't read it. The animal imagery suggests relationships with the natural world, but the specific beliefs remain opaque. Most importantly, we don't know where this tradition came from. The sophistication of the earliest work suggests inheritance rather than invention. People building on knowledge established earlier. But earlier where? Earlier when? We have no sites showing the developmental stages that should precede Göbekli Tepe. It appears in the archaeological record already accomplished, already sophisticated, already declining. So this is where the evidence leaves us, not with answers, but with doubt. 11,500 years ago, humans did something we were never supposed to be capable of, and then they stopped. The knowledge faded. The monuments shrank. The tradition vanished beneath the soil, waiting millennia for us to notice the cracks in our own assumptions. Taş Tepeler doesn't just challenge the story of civilization, it exposes how fragile that story really is. Because if complexity can emerge, disappear, and leave almost no trace, how many chapters of human history have already been erased? And if this much was hiding in plain sight, what else is still buried, quietly waiting to prove us wrong? The stones are still there, holding their secrets. We're just beginning to learn how to ask the right questions.